nice kitchen.
Right.
I mean, it's 30 degrees outside. It could be 20 degrees in the kitchen. And it was a shock for me, and a necessary one. It humbled me greatly when you don't have hot water, or you're living with rats and termites, and you definitely don't have internet connectivity. And just everything didn't work. And I had 3 kids in a country where everybody had 1 child. So this is all to say that first year made me realize I needed to make deeper connections and do more for myself. So that was when, after being in Shanghai for a year, I started my master's in comparative and international education. And it put things into great kind of focus for me because it helped me prioritize what was important for me. Absolutely, my children were. But then after that, it was me time. It was getting my master's, and then my good friends that I had made at that point. You make time for them, and then you don't make as much time for other people just because I couldn't. Not that I didn't like them, but and things happen more organically. But I definitely, that first year in Hong Kong, in Shanghai rather, was very instructive for the rest of my life.
I really, really enjoyed the book. There were moments in which I was, as I'm reading, well, here's a realization I just came to in my recent years, which a lot of my friends will joke that they're all of the things that you learned how to do in your 20s, like as a grown up. I don't know where I was under a rock, apparently. One of the things recently has been about reading books and the idea of when you're in a book, a novel, or any kind of book in which you're like, oh, okay, I'm plogging through it, right? For one reason or another. I'm not talking about your book, by the way. Why not just stop reading the book? Right? Why torture yourself to get to the end of the book if it's not, whatever reason, it's not sitting with you?
Yeah.
As I was reading your story, I was thinking, was there ever a moment in which you were kind of in this alternate universe and like, why am I doing this? Like, should I just stop now? Because it's either too hard or just, I'm exhausted or the kids are exhausted. Although it sounds like your kids were thriving in all of these experiences generally. At what point, at least for me, I was sitting there thinking, oh my God, this is where I would just close the book and walk away. Were there moments like that for you? And how did you get through those?
Let's see. If there are moments. It was probably when we moved. I mean, those were the times.
Yeah, it seemed like the transitions were a little bit harder.
It was time for us to get out of Hong Kong. 2012, ironically, it was the end of our second year in Shanghai. I didn't want to move. Even though the first year was so difficult, it was almost like I came, I conquered, I mastered.
I'm staying.
Yes, and now I need to stay.
Yeah.
And this opportunity came up for us to go to Tokyo, and I have family there. My kids are quarter Japanese. They didn't speak the language. I just felt like it was finally an opportunity for them to understand where they're from and where their mother's part. I mean, I grew up in the U.S., but I always went to Japan to see family. So just to understand their heritage. So that was a little too early, I felt like. But Japan was amazing. And after we were in Japan for 3 years, I did feel like it was time for us to move. Not because we were unhappy with Japan, but because my oldest was going to be finishing up elementary school, and I wanted him to be in the U.S. for middle school so that he had time to ease into a U.S. high school and then ultimately, hopefully, go to a U.S. university. And so that was definitely, okay, it's time for us to move from there. But that was for my oldest, and I would say it was too early for my youngest. She should have stayed in Japan longer. She loved it. And she'll, even if you ask her today, where's your happy place or where do you want to live? She'll say she wants to go back to Tokyo.
Oh, great.
Yeah. So, and then Palo Alto, if you read those chapters.
Oh my gosh.
I'm
almost embarrassed about that. Just being from California. I'm just embarrassed about all of that.
But I have to say, probably after a few days, I wanted to go.
Yeah.
No, I gave it probably. No, I did. In fact, I did. I gave it a year, and that's what I talk about. And then it was just, okay, we got to get out of here.
I mean, even in the North Bay where we live, nobody wants to go to Palo Alto because we hear the stories as well. And there's a lot of social chaos around the children and, especially in high school age down there as well. Like just the pressure, and it's overwhelming to the point where there's just, they're not even healthy. And that's very, very sad to me that the education system hasn't. There's just no balance, I think, between social and and the education side of things, generally speaking. Some places have a bigger gap. Before we get to some questions I have about the education system specifically, I do want to ask one more question. Do you have advice? I'll give you an example and then I'll ask if you have advice for parents who struggle with this. I have 2 children. My son, both kids are bilingual. My son, two different fathers. So my son's father is from Spain. So he's really immersed in it more than my daughter. So there's always this debate for me. My children started out in Montessori. He's still in Montessori, which I truly believe works for us and my children and maybe fills in some of the gaps that I can't provide. But bilingualism is very important to me as well. And as, like you, if I could send my kids to Spain to get educated or, and really immerse themselves in another culture, it'd be great. But when there are 2 parents who are debating which way is right, for us, it was like we had a Montessori option or we had a dual immersion option. And we didn't really agree on which was the best fit. Both of them would actually be great fits, but we both kind of prioritized something differently. I think that might happen quite commonly for parents. How do parents themselves navigate those conversations?
Well, that is, I think, a pretty common issue. And I'll tell you, I'm actually going through a divorce right now. So it's interesting because I was interviewed about a month ago about what's the change now. And I said, now I've been introduced to this terrible new word called co-parenting.
Oh God, right?
And I was like, oh gosh, because before the father of my children, my husband was away most of the time. So I made almost all of the decisions. So how to navigate those conversations, in my opinion, and my advice would be, who's going to be the main caregiver? Who's going to be involved in the school? Who's going to be managing the kids' educational experiences? Because as long as if we want to say it's 50-50, but the reality is,
right,
it's not going to be 50-50. It could change different times in the marriage, of course, or the relationship or the parenting. But for the most part, if there's going to be one person who's in charge of it, they have to be happy, because if they're not happy with its school choice, then everybody's going to be miserable.
Right.
So I would say that is the hard baseline. The mom or dad who's managing it more has to be happy with it.
I do also find myself going back to that idea of the margin of difference, right? Ultimately at the end of the day, there's exposure to a lot of different things, which are ultimately obviously making my children better in many ways, right? So yes, I guess you're right. It's, I'm doing all the work, so I'm making all the decisions.
But a lot of it too, and I talk about this in World Class, and I think it's at the very end of the book, actually. I say, be friends with, or even know the people in your kids' schools, the ones you can't stand. Because they're the ones who may be the most contentious, the squeaky wheel that gets the oil, the ones who may be, driving the ship, so to speak. And you should know what their opinions and thoughts are, because they have an influence on your kids' experience. So to me, there's so much about knowing the community that informs your child's education in the classroom itself. So that parent who is making the effort to go to the parent events, meet the other parents, maybe not get involved with the PTA, volunteer in the classroom. That's kind of the parent that you have to defer to, in my opinion.
Right.
Because they're playing that game.
Yeah, that's true. I really enjoyed the idea in World Class. You multiple times kind of do like an aside on here's how to navigate this, or here's some suggestions for you to go. So this is great. I'm a very tactical person. Like I can read all the books in the world and I get, okay, great. I've got theory. Show me how to do it. Give me a script. Yeah. So thank you for putting that in there. I think I think people are lucky to be able to do that. Let's talk about what your vision is for the work that you're doing in improving the system. And do you feel like you want to make an impact not only in the United States, but outside of the United States?
So that's a great question. And just to go back, when I wrote World Class, or when I first had the idea to write it, I mean, it was a seed that was planted, I want to say in 2013 was when I first had the idea. And it didn't come to fruition until I got back to the US and I realized, okay, now I understand my audience, because this is meant always for U.S. audience, but I didn't have the U.S. parenting experience. I didn't know what it was like to have kids in the U.S. education system. And then I had 3 kids in Palo Alto schools. And I was like, okay, now I get it. And so I kind of feel like I just had to write the book. And apparently that's how most authors write their books, because they just feel like it's not out there. They have a need. They have to do it. So since the book has been out, and it came out in late summer of 2019, I kind of wanted to throw it out there and see what would stick, what would resonate, what wouldn't, what would be contentious. And it's been really, really interesting. And I was actually just thinking about it this morning, because I do talk about technology more towards the end of the book. But I feel like in the beginning, when my book came out, I suddenly got pigeonholed as like the anti-tech, how are we doing this kind of thing. And that wasn't really what I wanted my platform to be. I was just thinking about this morning, actually. And then now when I think about it, I do have areas and I've talked about this already several times with you, is the U.S. has to fix its equity problem. We have a teacher recruiting, retention, professional development problem. And we have a governance problem where we have too many corporate interests in our classrooms. And those are the 3 big picture issues that I believe definitely have to change. And that's representative of a bigger culture and a cultural shift. Now, is that something that's going to be possible within my lifetime? I don't know. I mean, when parents, the reality is, and this is something I was thinking about yesterday when I was talking to someone, is you have to think about the macro and the micro issues that you have, because when you're fighting these macro issues, even the micro issues, you're typically in the school system not fighting them for your kids. You're fighting them for the kids who are coming in the following year, 5 years, 10 years.
Right.
So as good as your intentions may be, you may not reap the reward, but also you have to take responsibility for those changes for the next generation of kids. And is it going to be right for them? So those are the things that I think about. And if I would, and I'll get more specific in a moment, but the micro changes, I think, and there's not enough done, I feel like, in this country with, if we can't shift these macro changes really easily, we can work with parents who do have a hand in their kids' educational experiences every single day if they wanted to. And it doesn't have to be through 1 hour, in-depth conversations about what they learned in school or getting tutors. It can just be a values-based proposition where, are you prioritizing education and learning, and how are you spending your time? Because if your kid is on the soccer field 20 hours a week and they're not doing any reading, and you're on the sidelines cheering them on and you're not asking about the books they're reading, kids do want to be validated. As much as we say don't reward them and say good job, whatever, who doesn't want to be getting a sticker, like a smiley face sticker on their A+ work? We all kind of have that. It's just human nature, I feel like. So if you validate their educational learning experiences, or as people too, being good people, if they're doing something good, if they're standing up for someone who's elderly on the train, or holding a door open, or picking up garbage, or picking up after themselves, making their beds, commend them on that stuff, or at least acknowledge it.
Right.
So I put it all back to parents. So if parents can look at their values and how they practice them in their in their homes, and if they can figure out who's in their communities, that's the second thing that I often talk about. It's surprising how many times their classroom teacher may not have the largest influence in the school building. It could be the janitor. It could be the PE teacher. It could be the librarian. Oftentimes it is the librarian if you have a reader. And it's finding out not only within your school, but outside your school, who the people in your community are. And that's immediate family and extended family, people in your building, people in your neighborhood, people at the community center, people on your teams, whatever it is. So I talk about that and really examine what's going on in your day-to-day life. So to take it back to your big question, which is, what do I want to do? I'm working on a kids series, because part of my book, in the 2017-18 academic year, I traveled across the country and went to urban, rural, and suburban schools. And I met with principals, at preschools, elementary, middle, and high schools. I talked to university scholars of education. I went to tons of conferences. And what I found was, and, we're talking about climate change, for example, today. I didn't grow up. Like, I was born in the early 70s. I didn't grow up thinking about climate change. But the reality is, climate change is something that it is affecting us. Right. But our kids?
Oh, yes.
I mean, these are struggles that they are going to have to deal with on a daily basis.
Immediately as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. And You know, I love the World Economic Forum stories that are posted on Instagram, a little pitch for them. I have nothing to do with them, but they're really informative. And I would love for kids to watch those because they show how much the world is changing. So